All right, welcome back. So, for our mini lecture today, we're going to talk about five things that relate to the context behind why the U.S. entered the Spanish-American War. So, the first is the post-war generation. The second is going to be imperialism. The third is manhood, or toxic masculinity. The fourth is a guy named Alfred Thayer Mahan. And the fifth is going to be a military buildup. So first off, the post-war generation. So the post-war generation for the U.S. military really tended to be involved in 2 to 3 conflicts, if any. So one being the wars with indigenous peoples across the American West. Now, these were ultimately won by the United States military, but they tended to be brutal. They tended to be drawn out. There tended not to be very many set-piece battles. And there were aspects of this that scholars today discuss as related to aspects of genocide and atrocities committed by some units. Certainly, the Wounded Knee Massacre being a good example of this. So the Army after the Civil War then decreases in size. It fights these kinds of engagements. Another thing the military does during some of this time, really in the 1890s, is getting involved in things like helping to put down strikes and control public areas. So that post-war generation is not engaged in overseas deployments or anything like that, really, again, until the Spanish-American War. Secondly, imperialism in the second half of the 19th century was a defining aspect of foreign policies for many Western countries, the U.S. Included. From the days of the Congress of Berlin to the scramble on the part of Western nations to colonize the continent of Africa, the U.S. looked at much of this as observers, but certainly as a nation that could possibly make some inroads into expanding its interests abroad. Now, generally, the idea of imperialism tends to mean the extension of a sphere of influence on the part of one nation or area over another. And this would certainly be true on the part of the Americans in the 1890s and the early 1900s. The Spanish-American War would be a good example of this and what we get out of it. Thirdly is the idea of manhood. So that post-war generation, they spend a lot of time experiencing and hearing from their parents and uncles and family members about what it was like to fight in the Civil War. The Grand Army of the Republic, the United Confederate Veterans, these are very popular political organizations in the second half of the 19th century. And so the idea of service, the understanding of service was something that was valued, and there was a real sense amongst the generation of men kind of coming of age in the 1890s that conflict, in some ways was good. Fourth would be a guy named Alfred Thayer Mahan. So Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a book. He's a professor at the end of the 19th century, and he writes a book called The Influence of Sea Power upon History. And his theories really kind of lay out a historical causality or principle that previous leaders, superpowers globally, tended to have good navies, tended to have powerful navies. And what will happen in the second half of the 19th century is that leading Western powers will buy into this, and it will contribute, amongst a number of other factors, to a series of arms races that many of these nations will start into, the U.S. included. Now, one of the main outcomes of this, of course, will be the political climate and the contention of the early 1900s that will lead to the First World War. But, again, this is something that will result in why the U.S. is going to start heavily investing in new ships for its Navy in the 1890s. All right. The fifth aspect of this, then, would be that investment. So there will begin to be somewhat of a military transformation in the 1890s, a buildup that isn't perhaps moving fast enough for the U.S. to be as successful as they would like early in the Spanish-American War. But the emphasis on ship construction the emphasis on general staffing is a part of the transformation of the U.S. military at this time. All right. Thank you very much.